Some stories begin with happiness and end with tragedy, but there are other stories, the harder ones to tell, that begin with tragedy and lead you through darkness, making you wonder if light will ever find its way in. This is one of those stories. It's about a boy named Marcus Whitmore who learned the hardest lesson life could teach before he even turned 13 years old, that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones who hurt you the most. I want you to listen carefully because this isn't just a story. It's a reminder that trust is something precious, something that should be earned, not given away freely. And sometimes, even blood isn't thick enough to keep someone from bleeding you dry. Marcus Whitmore was born in a small town called Millbrook, just outside of Manchester in England. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, where the baker would save the slightly burnt bread for the widow down the street because he knew she couldn't afford the fresh ones, and where children still played football in the streets until the sun went down. Marcus's father, Jonathan Whitmore, was a well-respected man in town. He ran a small but successful construction company that his own father had started decades ago. His mother, Eleanor, was a schoolteacher who had this wonderful way of making everyone around her feel special. If you had seen the Whitmore family before everything changed, you would have seen a picture of simple happiness. Their house wasn't grand, but it was warm. It smelled of Eleanor's homemade biscuits on Sunday mornings and Jonathan's terrible attempts at cooking on Friday nights. Marcus would often sit at the kitchen table doing his homework while his parents playfully argued about whose turn it was to do the dishes. Those were the days when Marcus believed the world was kind, when he thought love was something that couldn't be broken. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It happened on a cold November evening when Marcus was 11 years old. His parents had gone to attend a charity dinner in the city, leaving Marcus with old Mrs. Patterson, their neighbor who had practically become his grandmother over the years. Marcus remembered that night clearly, how his mother had kissed his forehead 3 times before leaving, how his father had ruffled his hair and told him to be good for Mrs. Patterson. They looked so happy, so full of life. That was the last time he ever saw them alive. The police officer who came to the door that night had kind eyes, but Marcus could see something terrible hidden behind them. There had been an accident on the motorway. A lorry driver had fallen asleep at the wheel and crossed into the opposite lane. Jonathan and Eleanor Whitmore died on impact. They didn't suffer, the officer said, as if that was supposed to make it hurt less. Mrs. Patterson held Marcus as he cried that night, her old arms shaking as she tried to comfort a child whose world had just collapsed. Marcus didn't understand. How could they be gone? They had just been here. His mother had kissed him. His father had smiled at him. How could someone be alive one moment and gone the next? The funeral was held 5 days later on a gray, drizzling afternoon that seemed to match the mood of everyone gathered in the cemetery. Marcus stood at the front, staring at the 2 coffins being lowered into the ground, feeling like a part of him was being buried along with them. Relatives he barely recognized patted his shoulder and told him to be strong. Friends of his parents offered their condolences with tears in their eyes, but none of them offered him a home. That's when Vernon Whitmore stepped in. Vernon was Jonathan's younger brother, though the 2 men couldn't have been more different. While Jonathan had stayed in Millbrook to build the family business, Vernon had always been what people called a wanderer. He moved from city to city, job to job, always chasing some scheme or opportunity that never quite worked out. Marcus had only met his uncle a handful of times at family gatherings, and even then, Vernon always seemed distracted, always looking at his phone or excusing himself to take important calls. At the funeral, Vernon stood apart from everyone else, wearing a black suit that looked a little too expensive for a man who supposedly struggled to make ends meet. Marcus remembered how Vernon had approached him after the burial, placing a hand on his shoulder with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Don't you worry, Marcus," Vernon had said. "I'm going to take care of you now." That's what family is for, isn't it? Mrs. Patterson, who had been standing nearby, looked at Vernon with something that resembled suspicion. She had known the Whitmore brothers for years and had often heard Jonathan complain about Vernon's irresponsibility. But she was 82 years old and in no condition to raise a child herself. So when Vernon produced documents showing that Jonathan and Eleanor had named him as Marcus's legal guardian in the event of their deaths, there wasn't much anyone could do. Looking back, Marcus would often wonder if those documents were even real. Within 2 weeks, Marcus found himself leaving the only home he had ever known. Vernon sold the Whitmore house quickly, too quickly, some neighbors whispered, and packed Marcus's belongings into the back of a rented car. Marcus pressed his face against the window as they drove away, watching Millbrook disappear behind him, feeling like he was leaving behind the last pieces of his parents. Vernon took Marcus to Coventry, a larger city where Vernon rented a small flat in a gray, unwelcoming building. The flat had 2 bedrooms, though Vernon made it clear that the larger one was his. Marcus's room was barely bigger than a closet, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. It was nothing like his room back home, where sunlight poured in every morning and where his mother had painted stars on the ceiling so he could dream of adventures. "It's not much," Vernon said, dropping Marcus's suitcase on the floor, "but you'll get used to it. We all have to make sacrifices." For the first few months, Vernon maintained a convincing facade. He enrolled Marcus in a local school, bought him new uniforms, and even cooked dinner a few times. Marcus desperately wanted to believe that his uncle genuinely cared about him. He needed to believe it. Because if Vernon didn't care, then Marcus truly had no one left in the world. But cracks began to appear in Vernon's mask almost immediately. It started with small things. Vernon would forget to buy groceries, leaving Marcus to scrounge together meals from whatever he could find in the kitchen. Then Vernon started coming home late, smelling of alcohol, his words slurred and his temper short. Marcus learned quickly to stay out of his uncle's way on those nights, locking himself in his tiny room and pretending to be asleep. Then the questions about money began. "Your parents left you some money, didn't they?" Vernon asked one evening, about 3 months after Marcus had moved in. They were sitting at the small kitchen table, eating reheated pasta that Vernon had picked up from somewhere. Marcus looked up, confused. "I don't know. Mum and Dad never talked about money." Vernon's eyes narrowed slightly. There should be an inheritance. Insurance money, savings, maybe even the money from selling the house. "It all goes to you, doesn't it?" "I think so," Marcus said hesitantly. "The lawyer man said something about a trust fund, but I can't touch it until I'm 18. Vernon's jaw tightened, but he quickly forced a smile. "Right, right. Of course, that's good, Marcus, that's very good." Looking back, Marcus realized that was the moment Vernon's true intentions became clear, at least to everyone except Marcus himself. The boy was too young, too trusting, too desperate for family to see what was standing right in front of him. Vernon Whitmore hadn't taken in his nephew out of love or family obligation. He had taken him in because he saw Marcus as an opportunity, a meal ticket, a way to get his hands on money that wasn't his. What followed was a calculated manipulation that unfolded over the next 2 years. Vernon discovered that while Marcus couldn't access the main trust fund until he was 18, there was a separate account set up for his care and education, a monthly allowance that was supposed to cover his school fees, clothes, food, and general well-being. This money was released to his legal guardian, which meant it went directly into Vernon's pocket. At first, Vernon was careful. He made sure Marcus had what he needed for school, bought him the occasional new shirt when the old ones wore out, and kept up appearances whenever social workers came for their routine visits. But as time went on, Vernon became bolder. The monthly allowance that was meant for Marcus started disappearing into things that had nothing to do with the boy's care. Vernon's gambling habits, his nights out at pubs, his endless parade of get-rich-quick schemes that always seemed to fail. Marcus noticed, of course. He noticed when his school lunches became smaller. He noticed when Vernon stopped buying him new clothes entirely, forcing him to wear the same worn-out uniforms until they were practically falling apart. He noticed when the heating in the flat started going out during winter because Vernon forgot to pay the bill. But what could he do? He was 12 years old, alone in a city where he knew no one. Vernon was his only family. And despite everything, Marcus still clung to the hope that his uncle would change, that things would get better, that somewhere deep down, Vernon actually cared about him. That hope kept him going through the hardest days. School became both a refuge and a reminder of how different Marcus's life had become. He had always been a bright student. His mother had been a teacher, after all, and she had instilled in him a love of learning from an early age. But in Coventry, Marcus struggled to keep up. He was often tired from sleepless nights spent listening to Vernon stumble around the flat. He was hungry more often than not. And the other children, sensing his vulnerability, began to target him. There was a group of boys in his year led by someone named Jasper Thornton, whose father owned several properties in the city. Jasper had the kind of confidence that comes from never having known hardship, and he seemed to take a particular pleasure in making Marcus's life miserable. They would mock Marcus's worn clothes, his second-hand books, the way he always seemed to be alone. They would knock his lunch tray out of his hands in the cafeteria, knowing he couldn't afford to buy another meal. Marcus never fought back. He had learned from living with Vernon that fighting only made things worse. So he endured, swallowing his pride and his pain, telling himself that one day things would be different. There was one teacher, however, who saw through the facade. Her name was Miss Brennan, and she taught English. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with kind eyes and a voice that made even the most complicated books seem accessible. She was the first person in a long time who seemed to actually see Marcus, not as a problem to be pitied or a target to be bullied, but as a human being worthy of attention. "Marcus, could you stay after class for a moment?" Miss Brennan asked one afternoon when Marcus was about 13. Marcus felt his heart drop. He assumed he was in trouble. But when the other students filed out, Miss Brennan simply pulled up a chair and sat across from him. "I've noticed you've been falling asleep in class," she said gently. "And your essays, while brilliant in their ideas, have been getting shorter and more rushed. Is everything okay at home?" No one had asked Marcus that question since his parents died. Not really. Not in a way that suggested they actually wanted to hear the answer. For a moment, Marcus considered telling her everything, about Vernon's drinking, about the empty refrigerator, about the nights when Vernon would scream at him for no reason, calling him a burden, a mistake, a waste of space, about how lonely and scared he felt every single day. But he didn't. Because Vernon had warned him, in that cold, quiet voice he used when he wanted to be truly threatening, that if Marcus ever told anyone about their home life, he would be sent to a foster home where things would be much, much worse. "I'm fine, Miss Brennan," Marcus said, forcing a smile. "Just having trouble sleeping lately, but I'll do better." Miss Brennan didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I noticed you've been reading a lot during lunch," she said, handing it to him. "I thought you might enjoy this." Inside was a worn copy of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Marcus held it like it was made of gold. "It's about a boy who goes through very difficult times," Miss Brennan said softly. "But he never gives up. I think you might relate to him." That book became Marcus's most treasured possession. He read it in his tiny room at night, using a flashlight so Vernon wouldn't see the light under his door and yell at him for wasting electricity. He read about Pip, about hardship and hope, about how someone's circumstances didn't define their future. And for the first time since his parents died, Marcus began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something better waiting for him. But Vernon was about to remind him just how cruel the world could be. It happened a few months after Marcus turned 13. He came home from school to find Vernon sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of him. Vernon's face was flushed, and there was an empty bottle of whiskey nearby, never a good sign. "Sit down," Vernon said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Marcus sat, his heart already beating faster. "I've been thinking," Vernon said, his words slightly slurred. "You've been here almost 2 years now, eating my food, using my electricity, taking up space in my flat. And what have you given me in return?" Marcus's hands trembled under the table. I try to help Uncle Vernon. I clean the flat and—" "That's not enough," Vernon interrupted, slamming his hand on the table. "You need to start earning your keep, really earning it." That was the night Vernon informed Marcus that he would no longer be going to school full-time. Instead, he would spend 3 days a week working at various jobs that Vernon had arranged through people he knew. Cash-in-hand work, he called it, the kind of work that didn't ask questions about child labor laws. Marcus tried to protest. He loved school. It was the only place where he felt even remotely safe. But Vernon's eyes turned cold, and his hand moved toward his belt, and Marcus learned very quickly to keep his objections to himself. And so began the next chapter of Marcus's nightmare. Vernon's arrangements were worse than Marcus could have imagined. He was sent to work at a car wash owned by one of Vernon's gambling friends, scrubbing vehicles in the cold for hours on end. He was made to help out at a warehouse, moving heavy boxes until his arms ached and his back screamed in pain. He was even sent to work in the kitchen of a restaurant that should have been shut down for health violations years ago, washing dishes in scalding water until his hands were red and raw. All the money Marcus earned went directly to Vernon. Every single penny. If Marcus even thought about keeping something for himself, a few coins for a sandwich, a bit of change for the bus, Vernon seemed to know. And the punishment was swift and terrible. Vernon never hit Marcus in places where the bruises would show. He was too clever for that. But the boy learned to fear his uncle's hands, learned to flinch at the sound of Vernon's footsteps, learned to make himself as small and invisible as possible. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, though, it was the things Vernon would say. "You're worthless," Vernon would spit at him after a night of heavy drinking. "Just like your father was, always acting like he was better than me. Well, look where that got him, dead in a ditch, and now I'm stuck with his useless kid." Marcus would lie in his tiny room after nights like that, silent tears streaming down his face, wondering if Vernon was right. Wondering if he was worthless, wondering if his parents would be disappointed in what he had become. But then he would pull out the book Miss Brennan had given him, running his fingers over the worn pages, and he would remember Pip. He would remember that suffering wasn't permanent. He would remember that even the darkest nights eventually gave way to morning. Miss Brennan noticed the changes in Marcus, of course. His attendance became sporadic. When he did come to school, he was exhausted, sometimes struggling to keep his eyes open. His grades dropped. He became even more withdrawn than before. She tried to talk to him several times, but Marcus always deflected. He was terrified of what Vernon would do if he found out Marcus had been talking to anyone. And part of him, the part that had been beaten down and broken over 2 years of manipulation, had started to believe that maybe this was just how his life was meant to be. Then something happened that changed everything. One cold February morning, Marcus was in the school library during break time, trying to catch up on some reading he had missed. He was exhausted from a late shift at the warehouse the night before, and his eyelids kept drooping despite his best efforts. He must have fallen asleep because the next thing he knew, someone was shaking his shoulder. Marcus. "Marcus, wake up." He jerked awake to find Miss Brennan standing over him, her face etched with concern, but her expression changed as he sat up and her eyes fixed on something on his arm. His sleeve had ridden up while he slept, revealing a pattern of bruises that Marcus had been so careful to hide. "Marcus," Miss Brennan said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to your arm?" Marcus yanked his sleeve down, his heart pounding. "Nothing, I fell, it's nothing." But Miss Brennan wasn't fooled. She had seen bruises like that before in her years of teaching. She knew what they meant. "Marcus," she said gently, sitting down beside him, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever is happening at home, it is not your fault, and you don't have to face it alone." Marcus felt something crack inside him. All the walls he had built, all the defenses he had constructed to survive, they started to crumble. His eyes filled with tears, and for a moment he was just a scared, lonely child who missed his parents and wanted anyone to help him. "I can't," he choked out. "If I tell, it will be worse. He's who, Marcus, who is hurting you." And Marcus, despite his fear, despite everything Vernon had threatened, opened his mouth to answer. But before he could say a word, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Vernon. "I know you're not in class. Get home now. We need to talk about something important." The fear returned immediately, washing away everything else. Marcus stuffed the phone back in his pocket and stood up so quickly that he knocked his chair over. "I have to go," he said, unable to meet Miss Brennan's eyes. "I'm sorry." "I have to go." He ran out of the library before she could stop him, his heart pounding, his mind racing. Something was wrong. Vernon never texted him like that, never used words like important. When Marcus arrived at the flat, out of breath and terrified, he found Vernon waiting for him in the kitchen. But for once his uncle wasn't angry. In fact, he was smiling, a wide, unsettling smile that made Marcus's skin crawl. "There you are," Vernon said, gesturing for Marcus to sit. "I have wonderful news, nephew." "Simply wonderful news." Marcus sat slowly, not trusting the change in Vernon's demeanor. "I've been doing some research," Vernon continued, still wearing that strange smile, "about your parents' estate, about the trust fund. And I've found something very interesting." Marcus's blood ran cold. "It turns out," Vernon said, leaning forward, "that while the main trust is locked until you're 18, there's a clause, a lovely little clause, that allows the funds to be released early under certain circumstances. Medical emergencies, for example, or," his eyes glinted, "if your legal guardian can demonstrate that you are unable to manage your own affairs due to mental incapacity." Marcus didn't understand. What? "What are you saying?" Vernon's smile widened. "I'm saying, dear nephew, that I've found a doctor who is willing to sign some papers, papers that will say you are mentally unfit." And once those papers are signed, I become the full administrator of your trust fund. All of it, every penny your parents left behind. The room seemed to spin around Marcus. He felt like he was falling, like the ground had opened up beneath him. You can't, he whispered. That money, that's from Mum and Dad. It's supposed to be for my future. Vernon laughed, a cold, cruel sound that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Your future, Vernon sneered. Let me tell you something about your future, boy. Your future is whatever I decide it is. You have no one except me. And if you think anyone is going to believe a word you say against your loving uncle who took you in when no one else would, he shook his head, still laughing. You're even more naive than your fool of a father was. Marcus sat frozen, his mind racing. Everything he had endured, the work, the abuse, the isolation, it had all been leading to this. Vernon hadn't just wanted to use him. Vernon wanted to take everything his parents had left him, everything they had worked their whole lives for, and Marcus was completely, utterly powerless to stop him. The doctor is coming tomorrow afternoon, Vernon said, standing up and stretching. So I'd suggest you get a good night's sleep. You want to look your best for the examination. He walked toward his room, then paused at the door, looking back at Marcus with an expression that was almost pitying. Oh, and Marcus. Don't even think about running. I've had the locks changed, and I've told the neighbors you're a troubled child with mental problems who might try to escape. They'll bring you right back to me if you so much as step outside without my permission. Vernon disappeared into his room, leaving Marcus alone in the kitchen. For a long time, Marcus just sat there, unable to move, unable to think. Everything felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. His parents were gone, his home was gone. And now Vernon was going to take the last thing he had left, the money his mother and father had saved for him, the final proof that they had loved him and wanted him to have a good life. Finally, as the hours ticked by and the flat grew dark, Marcus retreated to his tiny room. He sat on his narrow bed, holding the copy of Great Expectations that Miss Brennan had given him, and for the first time in a very long time, he allowed himself to truly cry. He cried for his parents who had been taken from him too soon. He cried for his lost home, for the life he would never have again. He cried for himself, for the child he used to be, for the innocence that Vernon had slowly destroyed. And as the tears fell, a new feeling began to stir in his chest. It was small at first, just a flicker, but it grew stronger with each passing moment. It was anger. Marcus had spent 2 years being afraid, 2 years being used. 2 years believing that he was powerless, that he had no choice but to accept whatever Vernon did to him. But as he sat in that dark room, holding the book that reminded him of hope, something shifted inside him. He thought of Pip, who had been used by everyone around him but had still found a way to become something more. He thought of Miss Brennan, who had looked at him like he mattered. He thought of his parents, who would have wanted him to fight, to survive, to never give up. Vernon thought Marcus was completely alone. Vernon thought he had won, but Vernon had made one mistake. He had underestimated a 13-year-old boy who had nothing left to lose. Marcus wiped his eyes and took a deep breath. The doctor was coming tomorrow afternoon. That meant he had less than 24 hours to find a way out of this nightmare. He didn't know how yet, he didn't know who could help him or what he could do, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was not going to let Vernon win, not without a fight. Marcus didn't sleep that night, how could he? Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Vernon's face, that terrible smile, the cold certainty in his uncle's voice. The doctor was coming tomorrow afternoon. That gave Marcus roughly 16 hours to figure out a way to save himself. He sat on his narrow bed, his back against the wall, thinking harder than he had ever thought in his life. Vernon had changed the locks. Vernon had told the neighbors Marcus was mentally unstable. Vernon had spent 2 years isolating him, making sure he had no one to turn to, no one who would believe him. But that wasn't entirely true, was it? There was Miss Brennan. Marcus thought about the look in her eyes that morning in the library, the way she had sat beside him and told him it wasn't his fault. She had seen the bruises. She knew something was wrong. And unlike everyone else in Marcus's life, she had actually seemed to care. But how could he reach her? Vernon had made it clear that Marcus wasn't allowed to leave the flat. The locks had been changed. The neighbors were watching. And even if Marcus managed to get out, he had no phone. Vernon had taken it after sending that message and no money for a bus. Then he remembered something. The flat was on the 3rd floor of the building, but there was a fire escape outside the kitchen window. Vernon never locked that window because it was old and stuck, and he assumed no one could open it anyway. But Marcus had tried to open it once, months ago, when the flat had gotten unbearably hot during a summer heatwave. He knew that if you pushed it in a certain way, at a certain angle, it would pop open. It was risky. The fire escape was rusty and probably not entirely safe, and Marcus would have to climb down 3 floors in the dark, then walk across the city to find Miss Brennan's address, which he didn't even know. But what choice did he have? Marcus spent the next few hours preparing. He packed a small bag with the only things that mattered to him: the copy of Great Expectations, a photograph of his parents that he had managed to save from the house in Millbrook, and a few clothes. He wrote down everything he could remember about Vernon's schemes: the jobs he had been forced to work, the money that had been taken, the names of the places and people involved. If he was going to ask for help, he needed to have evidence, something concrete that would prove he wasn't just a troubled child making up stories. Around 4 in the morning, when the building was completely silent and even Vernon's snoring had settled into a steady rhythm, Marcus crept out of his room. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the grimy window. Marcus moved carefully, avoiding the spots on the floor that he knew would creak. He reached the window and took a deep breath. This was it. There was no going back. He pushed the window frame exactly the way he remembered, up, then to the left, then up again. For a horrible moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groaning sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence, the window popped open. Marcus froze, listening for any sign that Vernon had woken up. Seconds passed, a minute, nothing. He climbed out onto the fire escape, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The metal was cold and slippery with frost, and it creaked ominously under his weight, but it held. One step at a time, Marcus made his way down. 3 floors had never seemed so far. By the time he reached the bottom, his hands were numb and his legs were shaking. But he was out, he was free. Now he just had to find Miss Brennan. Marcus didn't know where she lived, but he knew the school would have records. More importantly, he remembered overhearing some students talk about how Miss Brennan often arrived at school early to prepare for her classes, sometimes as early as 6 in the morning. If he could get to the school before first period started, he might be able to catch her. The walk across Coventry took nearly 2 hours. Marcus stuck to side streets and alleys, terrified that Vernon would somehow realize he was gone and come looking for him. Every car that passed made him flinch. Every person he saw made him want to hide. By the time he reached the school, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The building was still locked, but Marcus could see a light on in one of the classrooms. Miss Brennan's classroom. He found a spot near the entrance and waited, huddled against the cold, watching the windows of the English department. At around 6:30, he saw a figure moving around inside. It was her. Marcus didn't have a plan for what to say. He didn't know how to explain 2 years of horror in a way that would make sense. But when Miss Brennan finally emerged from the building to fetch something from her car and saw him standing there, a thin, exhausted boy with dark circles under his eyes and frost on his jacket, she didn't ask for an explanation. She simply opened her arms, and Marcus, who hadn't been hugged by anyone since Mrs. Patterson held him on the night his parents died, fell into them and broke. Everything came out. The abuse, the forced labor, the stolen money, the isolation, the threats. Vernon's plan to have him declared mentally unfit. The doctor who was coming that very afternoon. Marcus talked until his voice was hoarse and his tears had run dry, and through it all Miss Brennan listened. When he finally finished, she was pale and shaking, not with fear, but with barely contained fury. "That monster," she whispered. "That absolute monster." She led Marcus inside the school and took him to the headmaster's office, where she made a series of phone calls that would change everything. The first was to the police. The second was to Child Protective Services. The third was to a lawyer she knew who specialized in cases involving minors. Within 2 hours, Marcus found himself sitting in a small room at the local police station, wrapped in a blanket someone had given him, while officers and social workers moved around him in a coordinated blur of activity. A kind woman named Patricia sat with him, explaining what was happening in gentle terms that Marcus's exhausted mind could barely process. Vernon had been arrested at the flat. He had apparently woken up to find Marcus gone, and had been in the process of calling everyone he knew to track down the boy when the police arrived. Patricia told Marcus that Vernon had tried to play the concerned guardian at first, but his story had fallen apart almost immediately when officers found the locked bedroom, the evidence of the illegal work, and the papers for the fake mental health evaluation sitting right on the kitchen table. "He kept records," Patricia said, shaking her head in disbelief. "He actually kept records of everything he stole from your care fund, dates, amounts, what he spent it on. It's like he never thought anyone would ever find out." Marcus wasn't surprised. Vernon had always been arrogant, always believed he was the smartest person in the room. That arrogance had been his undoing, but there was something else. Among the documents police found in Vernon's bedroom was a file that Marcus had never seen before. It contained papers related to his parents' estate, copies of their will, and correspondence with lawyers from the weeks following their death. And one particular document changed everything Marcus thought he knew about the past 2 years. The guardianship papers that Vernon had presented after the funeral, the ones that supposedly proved Jonathan and Alina had named him as Marcus's legal guardian, were forgeries. Expertly done forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. The lawyer who had handled the Whitmore estate had already confirmed it. In their actual will, Jonathan and Alina had made very different arrangements. Their first choice for Marcus's guardian had been Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had loved him like a grandson. But recognizing that she was quite elderly and might not be able to care for a child long-term, they had also named a secondary guardian. A woman named Catherine Brennan, who had been Alina's best friend during her university years and was Marcus's godmother, a role Marcus had never even known existed. Catherine Brennan, Miss Brennan. When Patricia told him this, Marcus couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He just sat there staring at her, trying to process what he was hearing. Miss Brennan was his godmother, his mother's best friend. And she had been at his school this whole time without either of them knowing. Later, Marcus would learn the full story. Catherine had lost touch with Alina after university, when life took them in different directions. She had never received word of Alina's death. Vernon had made sure of that, intercepting communications and ensuring that no one from the Whitmore's real circle of friends and family could interfere with his plans. By the time Catherine took a teaching position in Coventry 2 years later, she had no idea that her godson was living in the same city, let alone that he was one of her own students. But she had noticed Marcus. She had seen something in him that reminded her of someone, though she could never quite place it. His love of reading, his quiet resilience, the sadness in his eyes, it had all drawn her to him in a way she couldn't explain. Now she understood why. When Miss Brennan Catherine came to the police station that afternoon, her face was streaked with tears. She had spent the last few hours learning the truth about who Marcus really was, about the friend she had lost without ever knowing, about the godson who had been suffering right under her nose. "I'm so sorry," she said, kneeling in front of Marcus and taking his hands. "I should have pushed harder, I should have done more. When I saw those bruises, I should have." "You couldn't have known," Marcus said, and he meant it. He made sure no one knew. He was careful. "Your mother talked about you," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "Before we lost touch, she used to send me pictures when you were a baby. She called you her little miracle. She loved you so much, Marcus." They both did. For the first time since his parents died, Marcus felt something he had almost forgotten, the warmth of being genuinely wanted. The investigation into Vernon Whitmore took several months, and what it revealed was even worse than anyone had initially suspected. Vernon had been in significant debt long before Marcus's parents died. He owed money to loan sharks, had gambling debts that stretched back years, and had been facing bankruptcy. When Jonathan and Alina were killed in the accident, Vernon saw an opportunity. He forged the guardianship documents, convinced a corrupt official to help him push the paperwork through quickly, and took custody of Marcus before anyone could raise questions. The monthly care allowance had been just the beginning. Vernon had always been after the main trust fund, over £200,000 that Jonathan and Alina had saved over their entire lives. He had spent 2 years trying to find a way to access it, and the mental incompetency scheme had been his final, desperate attempt. But there was more. During the investigation, police discovered that Vernon had also been systematically looting the construction business that Jonathan had built. As Marcus's guardian, Vernon had claimed authority over the business as well, and he had been selling off equipment, contracts, and property while running the company into the ground. By the time he was arrested, there was almost nothing left of the legacy Jonathan Whitmore had spent his life building. When Marcus learned this, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just that Vernon had used him. Vernon had tried to destroy everything his father had ever created. Every dream Jonathan had had, every sacrifice he had made, every late night and early morning he had worked, Vernon had tried to erase it all, but he had failed. Because the one thing Vernon hadn't been able to touch was the trust fund itself. Thanks to Marcus escaping when he did, the scheme to have him declared mentally unfit had fallen apart. The money his parents had saved for him, every penny of it was still there, waiting for him, More importantly, Marcus was still there, still standing, still fighting. Vernon Whitmore was charged with fraud, forgery, child abuse, and a host of other crimes. His trial was brief and decisive. Multiple witnesses came forward, the owners of the businesses where Marcus had been forced to work, neighbors who had suspected something was wrong but had been too afraid to speak up, even the corrupt official who had helped Vernon forge the guardianship papers and was now trying to save himself by cooperating with authorities. The judge showed no mercy. Vernon was sentenced to 14 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution for everything he had stolen. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Marcus with an expression of pure hatred. But Marcus didn't flinch. He held his uncle's gaze until Vernon disappeared through the courtroom doors, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt strong. In the weeks and months that followed, Marcus's life transformed in ways he could barely comprehend. Catherine Brennan formally adopted him, fulfilling the role his mother had always intended for her to play. They moved into a small house on the outskirts of Coventry, far from the gray flat where Marcus had spent so many terrible nights. His new room was bright and warm, with large windows that let in the morning sun and walls that Catherine let him paint whatever color he wanted. He chose blue, the same shade as the sky on the day his parents had taken him to the beach, one of his happiest memories. Mrs. Patterson, who was now 84 years old but still sharp as ever, was finally reunited with Marcus after 2 years of searching. She had never stopped looking for him, never stopped writing letters to social services and police departments trying to find out what had happened to the boy she loved like a grandson. When the news broke about Vernon's arrest, she had seen Marcus's name and immediately got on a train to Coventry. Their reunion was one of the most emotional moments of Marcus's life. Mrs. Patterson held him for what felt like hours, crying and apologizing and telling him she should have fought harder to keep him. "I knew something was wrong," she kept saying. "I knew that man wasn't right, but they wouldn't listen to me. They said I was too old, said the legal guardian had already been established. I should have done more." "You're here now," Marcus told her, and that was enough. Mrs. Patterson eventually moved to Coventry as well, into a small flat near Catherine's house. She became a regular fixture in Marcus's new life, coming over for Sunday dinners and helping with his homework and telling him stories about his parents that he had never heard before. It was through Mrs. Patterson that Marcus finally learned the truth about his father and Vernon. The brothers had always had a complicated relationship, she explained. Jonathan was the responsible one, the one who stayed and built something lasting. Vernon was the dreamer, always chasing schemes that never worked out. For years, Jonathan had tried to help his younger brother, giving him loans that were never repaid, offering him jobs that Vernon always quit, making excuses for him when others in the family had given up. But about a year before his death, Jonathan had finally cut Vernon off. He had discovered that Vernon had been stealing from the family business, skimming money from accounts and forging receipts. Jonathan confronted him, and the two brothers had a terrible argument. Vernon said things that could never be taken back, cruel, vicious things about Jonathan, about Alina, even about Marcus. After that night, the brothers never spoke again. "Your father was devastated," Mrs. Patterson said. "He loved Vernon despite everything, but some betrayals are too deep to forgive." Marcus understood now why Vernon had harbored such hatred for him, why the abuse had gone beyond simple greed into something darker and more personal. In Vernon's twisted mind, Marcus represented everything he resented about his brother, the son Jonathan loved, the future Vernon could never have, the reminder of the man who had finally seen him for what he truly was. But none of that was Marcus's fault. It had never been his fault. Learning this truth was like having a weight lifted from his shoulders. All those nights when Vernon had told him he was worthless, that he was a burden, that no one would ever want him, they were the words of a broken, bitter man who couldn't stand to see goodness in others because he had none in himself. Marcus wasn't worthless, he wasn't unwanted. He was loved by his parents who had planned for his future even in death, by Mrs. Patterson who had never stopped searching for him, by Catherine who had opened her heart and her home to him. And he was going to make them proud. 3 years passed. Marcus threw himself into his studies with a determination that impressed everyone around him. He graduated from secondary school with top marks and was accepted into a prestigious university to study law. His choice of career was no accident. During the trial against Vernon, Marcus had watched the lawyers work, how they used evidence and argument to bring justice to those who had been wronged, how they gave voice to people who had been silenced. He wanted to do that. He wanted to make sure that what happened to him never happened to another child. On the day Marcus turned 18, he finally gained access to the trust fund his parents had left him. It was more money than he had ever imagined, enough to pay for university, to buy a home, to build a future. But there was something else waiting for him, too. Catherine presented him with a box she had received from the estate lawyers. It had been stored in a safety deposit box that Vernon had never known about, one that only released its contents when Marcus came of age. Inside, Marcus found letters, dozens of them. His mother had written him a letter on every birthday from the day he was born, intending to give them all to him when he turned 18. They were filled with stories about his first steps, his first words, the funny things he said as a toddler, the hopes she had for his future. She wrote about her love for Jonathan, about her dreams for their family, about how Marcus had changed her life in ways she could never adequately express. The final letter had been written just weeks before the accident. "My darling Marcus," it read, "as I write this, you are 11 years old and I am watching you do your homework at the kitchen table. You're concentrating so hard, your tongue sticking out the way it does when you're really focused on something. Your father is pretending to cook dinner, and we both know I'll have to rescue it in about 10 minutes. I don't know when you'll read this letter. By the time you do, you'll be a man, 18 years old, ready to take on the world. And I want you to know something important. Life will not always be kind to you. There will be people who try to hurt you, who try to take advantage of you, who try to make you believe you are less than you are. You might face losses that feel impossible to bear. You might have moments when you want to give up. But I want you to remember this. You are loved. You have always been loved. And no matter what happens, no matter how dark things get, that love is inside you. It's part of who you are. Be brave, my son. Be kind. Stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. And never, ever forget that you are my little miracle, the best thing that ever happened to me. I love you more than words can say, forever and always." Mom. Marcus read the letter 3 times before he could see through his tears. He held it against his chest and let himself cry, not from sadness this time, but from something else, something like healing. His mother had known, somehow she had known that life would try to break him. And she had left him this letter as a reminder that he was stronger than anything the world could throw at him. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Marcus drove to Millbrook for the first time since he had been taken away. The town looked smaller than he remembered, but it was still beautiful. The same narrow streets, the same friendly faces, the same sense of community that his parents had loved so much. He visited their graves in the cemetery where he had stood as an 11-year-old boy, watching his world collapse. But this time, he didn't feel like he was falling apart. "Hi, Mum." "Hi, Dad," he said, kneeling on the grass in front of their headstones. "I know it's been a while. I'm sorry I couldn't come sooner. Things were complicated." He told them everything. About Vernon, about the years of abuse, about his escape and the trial, about Catherine and Mrs. Patterson and the life he was building now, about university and his dreams of becoming a lawyer. About the letters from his mother that he had read so many times he had memorized every word. "I made it," he said finally. "I know you worried about me. I know you tried to protect me even after you were gone. And I want you to know that it worked. I'm okay. I'm more than okay." He placed flowers on both graves, lilies for his mother, who had always loved them, and roses for his father, who had brought them home for Alina every anniversary without fail. "I'm going to make you proud," Marcus whispered. "I promise." As he walked back to his car, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cemetery, Marcus felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was still long and there would be more challenges to face, but he was ready, because he had learned the most important lesson life could teach, that even in the darkest moments when it seems like everyone has abandoned you and there's no way out, hope is never truly lost. It might be hard to see, it might be buried under layers of pain and fear, but it's there waiting for you to find it. And when you do, when you finally grab hold of it and refuse to let go, that hope can carry you through anything. Marcus Whitmore had been a poor orphan boy, used and betrayed by the one person who should have protected him. But that was not where his story ended. It was only where his real story began. 7 years later, Marcus stood in a courtroom in London, but this time he wasn't a victim. He was a lawyer, one of the youngest and most passionate advocates for children's rights in the country. His specialty was representing minors who had been abused or exploited by family members, and his reputation for never giving up on a case had made him a beacon of hope for countless children who had nowhere else to turn. The case he was working on that day was painfully familiar. A 12-year-old girl named Sophie had been placed in the care of her step-uncle after her mother's death, and the pattern of abuse was almost identical to what Marcus himself had experienced. But Sophie was lucky in one crucial way: she had found Marcus. As he presented his closing argument, Marcus looked at Sophie sitting in the gallery. She was small and scared, just like he had been. But there was also something else in her eyes, a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there when they first met. This child, Marcus said, his voice strong and clear, was failed by the very systems designed to protect her. She was placed in the care of a man who saw her as nothing more than a source of income, a burden to be exploited. But Sophie is not a burden. She is a human being with dreams and potential and so much to offer the world. And today, I am asking this court to give her something that everyone deserves but too many never receive: a chance. The judge ruled in Sophie's favor. Her step-uncle was stripped of his guardianship and faced criminal charges. Sophie was placed with a loving foster family who had already expressed interest in adopting her. After the verdict, Sophie found Marcus in the hallway outside the courtroom. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved me." Marcus knelt down so he was at her eye level. "No, Sophie, you saved yourself. You were brave enough to speak up, brave enough to fight. I just helped. But you did the hard parts." Sophie hugged him, and Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes. He thought of himself at that age, lost and alone and certain that no one would ever come to help him. He thought of Miss Brennan in the library, of the book she had given him, of the moment when everything began to change. "It gets better," he told Sophie, and he meant every word. "I know it's hard to believe right now. But one day you're going to look back at this moment and realize it was the beginning of something new, something good." That evening, Marcus had dinner with Catherine and Mrs. Patterson at the house in Coventry. They did this every month without fail, no matter how busy Marcus's schedule became. Family dinner, Catherine called it, and after all these years, Marcus still got a warm feeling in his chest every time he heard that word: family. After dinner, while Mrs. Patterson dozed in her favorite chair by the fire, Catherine handed Marcus a cup of tea and sat beside him on the sofa. "How are you really doing?" she asked, the way she always did, not as a formality, but because she genuinely wanted to know. Marcus thought about it. He thought about the cases he worked, the children he helped, the nightmares that still sometimes woke him in the middle of the night. He thought about the scars that would never fully heal, the trust that was still hard to give, the part of him that would always be that scared 13-year-old boy climbing down a fire escape in the dark. But he also thought about the love that surrounded him now, the purpose he had found, the knowledge that his pain had been transformed into something meaningful, something that could help others avoid the same fate. "I'm good," he said finally. "I really am." Catherine smiled and squeezed his hand. "Your mother would be so proud of you, your father too. They would be absolutely bursting with pride." Marcus looked at the photo of his parents that sat on Catherine's mantel, the same photograph he had grabbed from his room that night when he escaped from Vernon. They were smiling, their arms around each other, looking at the camera with such love and hope. He liked to think they were watching him somehow, that they knew what he had become, the lives he was touching, the justice he was fighting for. He liked to think that wherever they were smiling. "I know," Marcus said softly, "I know they would be." Outside, snow had begun to fall, covering the world in a blanket of white. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and Mrs. Patterson snored gently in her chair, and Catherine hummed a tune that Marcus recognized as one his mother used to sing. And Marcus Whitmore, once a poor orphan boy, used and betrayed by his own uncle, sat in the warmth and light, surrounded by family, and allowed himself to feel truly happy. Some stories begin with tragedy. Some stories are filled with darkness and pain and moments when hope seems lost forever. But the best stories, the ones that stay with us, that remind us what it means to be human, are the ones that show us how even the deepest wounds can heal. Not completely, not perfectly. The scars remain, reminding us of what we survived, but we do survive, we grow, we find our way back to the light, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to help others find their way too. That is the true ending of Marcus Whitmore's story. Not an ending, really, a beginning.